Hello, I am Alberto Grignolo, DIA Fellow and Editor-in-Chief of DIA Global Forum. We are here at the 2023 DIA Global Annual Meeting in Boston, and it is my great pleasure to welcome my guest, Dr. David Mukanga of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Mukanga is Deputy Director, Africa Regulatory Systems for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's also our Global Forum Regional Editor for Africa and has really kindly provided so many wonderful articles about what is happening in Africa in our ecosystem, and particularly the evolution of the process that is leading to the establishment of the African Medicines Agency, AMA, later in 2023 in Kigali, Rwanda. So I'm delighted that he's also the Honorary Co-Chair of this DIA Global Annual Meeting here in Boston, and delighted to have you, David, here in town and for the conversation that we're about to have. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Alberto. It's a pleasure, always.
Yeah. First of all, just to set the stage, your thoughts on being the Honorary Co-Chair of this Global Annual Meeting. What is the significance of that role in your mind?
Wow, this was a great honor. I mean, I have been part of DIA Europe meetings virtually and so on, but this is my first time to attend the global annual meeting. And the community that DIA brings, the life sciences community, I think for me to be on the stage with June and highlight the issues that are important in Africa, and when people thinking about innovation, the delivery context being different there, and people encouraging people to think about that as they innovate, I think is a great opportunity for Africa to showcase, the need for the innovative industry, not to forget Africa as it thinks about development of innovation and so on. Africa is a huge population, 1.4 billion people, continuing to grow, and shouldn't be left behind, whether it's in clinical trials or product introduction. So I think it was a good opportunity and an honor for me, to be on the stage. So thank you all for organizing this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. You mentioned Africa is a huge continent, and we know that to be true. We've heard at this annual meeting that Africa, by 2050, will have as residents 25% of the world's population. It's a huge number.
Yeah. So while the rest of the world, the population is sort of, plateauing, in some places going down, we are going up like a rocket.
It's the growth rate of the population in Africa?
The growth rate, very huge young population, but in many places, half of the population is under 20, so a lot of energy, a lot of passion, they want to contribute, and I think they're going to be important contributor to the global economy, opportunities to offer labor, skills, and so forth.
So the low birth rate that are plaguing countries like Japan and Italy and others is not really a factor in Africa?
Not as yet. I think that's 20, 30 years away. Yeah, I think for the next 20, 30 years, Africa's population is going to continue to go up.
Talk more about the opportunities in Africa for clinical research and its impact and contribution to global clinical research and the development of medicines. What role can Africa play in the coming years and decades?
It's a great question. I mean, we all recognize that, Africa has a big proportion of disease burden, especially infectious diseases, perhaps 25% or so. But there's very little in terms of clinical research happening on the continent for a variety of reasons, and we can get into that, sites, regulatory, and lack of predictability, but also just the ease of getting in and running the studies, operational issues and so forth. Those are being addressed. But let me start first with what is already happening, I think, as what Africa is offering, and then what it could be in the future. I think there are, especially in the pandemic diseases that mainly affect Africa. If you think about Ebola, you think about Lassa, you think about a couple of others, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, and so on, which sort of endemic and pop up from time to time on the continent. There's a lot of research going on there to develop therapeutics, vaccines, and so forth. When there's an outbreak, that can affect the whole world, like we saw with Zika, like we saw with Ebola in 2015, and so forth. So a lot of the clinical studies are happening on the continent, and I think that's going to be a contribution of Africa in the development of these vaccines, in development of therapeutics, and so on. But I think also in the other areas, I think because of the high burden of HIV, I mean, Africa still has the highest burden of HIV, TB. Malaria is more or less wiped out in many places, except a few pockets in Asia. But again, there's still quite a bit of research happening in those areas, a lot in South Africa, a little bit in East Africa, and so on. So those are contributions, new advances in HIV preventive prevention and therapy. TB is still a huge problem on the continent. So you will see some breakthrough, therapies coming through in the future, with a lot of that data coming from Africa. So that will be a contribution, but it's still a bucket in the ocean. There's very little in cardiovascular, hypertension, and these are going to be huge problems on the continent. Yes, the population is young, but that ethnologic transition is starting to happen, and there's going to be a huge problem. And I think Africa needs to contribute to that. And I think it's upon we on the continent and our partners on the continent to create that environment to attract companies to come and do research on the continent. And that not only in terms of developing innovation, it has another benefit. If companies come on the continent, it's going to help to keep the scientific talent. There are a lot of young Africans who go train abroad in excellent universities, but when they come back to the continent, there are no opportunities, to plug into research. People who have a career aspiration to do research, the opportunities are very limited. So they end up leaving the continent and going to Europe, coming to the United States, going to other places. So as the research opportunities grow, that talent will stay on the continent and contribute globally, but also to the development of the African continent. So I think the onus is on Africa to, with our leaders, to create that environment that will attract investment in R&D, but also for our governments to begin to contribute themselves to R&D, so that we can attract and retain the African talent and global talent indeed to come to the African continent. But I think also it will benefit the rest of the world. I mean, when you see the migration in the Sahel and so on, I think opportunities on the continent are going to be good for Europe. The migration that we see, a lot of the tragedies in the Mediterranean, that it will create opportunities, not only in this field, but other fields for all young people to stay and thrive on the continent, because, they are growing and they don't see opportunities and they are forced to look for opportunities elsewhere.
In terms of creating infrastructure for clinical research and discovery in African countries, one could imagine that there are roles for local governments as well as roles for, say, industry from abroad, bringing in investment to invest, for example, in clinical trials or even in basic research. How do you think those two parties can perhaps play together?
And non-profits like the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and so on. I think it has to be a concerted effort, where people recognize what is needed to create that environment, the talent, the systems, not just the science, but even just administering projects, grants, and so on. The operational elements, you need those in institutions, in academic institutions. Those are the soft sides of that infrastructure. Laboratories, you want to store and move samples. Do you have that infrastructure and all of that? And I think that's the partnership, governments that will recognize that this will contribute to the economy, will contribute to the talent that they retain. They make a contribution and attract others, non-profits and companies, and say, look, this is what we're doing, come in and invest here, but it's tough. There are several countries and governments that are trying to invest in science, technology, innovation. This is at a very high level. At the African Union, there is efforts around science, technology, and innovation. They bring these ministers to discuss and align on how to do that. But I guess at the same time, the governments have to strike a balance between this and roads and healthcare and education and so on. But they have to recognize that they have to invest in the long term, not just in the short term. Yes, there are huge short-term needs, but you have to invest in the long term. And I think the greatest talent is the human capital, not the minerals in the ground. The minerals will contribute to it, and they can use that but invest in, in the human capital and in the infrastructure in the, 21st century, science and technology. Yeah.
What do you think needs to happen in African countries, maybe selected African countries, realizing there are different realities across the continent, but what needs to happen at the local level to attract foreign investment in research and clinical research in particular for development of new medicine?
It's a great question. I mean, one needs to ask themselves, if think about COVID, and what happened during the pandemic, and Africa suffered a lot because, we got the vaccines last. A lot of the clinical trials happened elsewhere because the burden anyway was elsewhere. But there are going to be conditions where, the burden is just as much in Africa or more in Africa, and that's important. But burden is not enough. Just having the disease burden is not enough. So I think the issues around transparency, when you think about if I'm going to go to a country, on the regulatory front, if I'm going to put in an application, how long is it going to take for me to get an answer? Is the process clear? Are the requirements clear? And is it predictable? I think that's an important element that we and our partners are working on, the African Union and the countries, the regulators, to address. That's one piece. I think the second one is at sort of the governance level, democracy, the development of democracy and transparency and corruption and those elements, nobody wants to work in a country where things are unclear, and you put in an application and you have to do under the table payments to make things to happen. Those are things governments have to deal with, and I think those are low-hanging fruit. If the governments are serious, this low-hanging fruit to say, guys, we have to deal with this issue, otherwise we're not going to make progress. Yeah, and then the more complicated, the other stuff, and those are the difficult, this low-hanging fruit, but those are the ones they really need to focus on and begin to invest. Then the partners will come in and bring the hardware and so on, and the capacity will be developed. Yeah.
Yeah, issues in clinical research also involve GCP compliance and the ability of principal investigators to understand the principles of international GCP, to be able to apply them and live them, having sites that are really equipped and prepared, at least to accept those concepts, apply them to clinical studies. Where is Africa on that? Again, I realize it's 55 countries. They are very different, and so there will be some that are perhaps readier than others. Yeah. But what are your thoughts about readiness for GCP quality trials, world-class trials?
That is evolving. It's been an issue, but there's a lot of progress in that area. You have a lot of well-trained African scientists, in many places, from South Africa through East Africa, Mali, places like that. They're very well-trained groups there that have very strong partnerships. For example, in Mali with University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins, and so forth. Well-trained people who come and train here and go back. So they understand these issues, and I think the fodder is there to work with. As I was alluded to earlier, the problem is that when you have these very well-trained people who come and train here in Boston, at Harvard and MIT and so on, and then they go back, but the opportunities are not there, the environment is constraining, then they're going to leave. But there are pockets of these groups that are really working well in partnership, and I think partnerships are key, where you have African scientists partnering with scientists from elsewhere and creating these sites. And there are very good examples. You go in Malawi, for years, the Wellcome Trust has had sites there, funded sites there with Oxford and so on. In Kilifi in Kenya with Oxford, the NIH in multiple places and so forth. These partnerships are possible, but it takes, partners, local partners and international partners coming together to create those environments, and they can sustain them. Yes, there will be challenges between trials sometimes, they have no work between that and sustaining that and so forth. But I think as they package and, these sites are set up and they communicate and articulate the capacities that are there, that will help a lot. the foundation has been working with partners on the African continent,
The Gates Foundation.
the Gates Foundation, to create what is called the clinical trial community. That is a one-stop center where you go and you will see sites, you see the capacities they have, in terms of the trials they have done, what phases, what diseases, the scientists who are there, have they got GCP training, what are their experiences and so on. It's like a LinkedIn with all the experts there and so forth. The regulatory requirements in that country, ethics, regulatory. So you can see that, and it becomes easier than all the time. You still need to do a landscape, perhaps to some degree, but at least there is a foundation to begin with. So these kinds of, of aggregating of information and insights that can help people to quickly make decisions, I think will help people a lot to, say, okay, I can see there's a great site there in Mozambique. Let me call on them and see if we can strike a partnership and do some work there. Those kind of enablers, I think, will help a lot as well. Yeah.
David, let's talk a little about the African Medicines Agency. And again, we're grateful from the IA Global Forum for the articles that you provided over the last 3-4 years as the African Union was crafting the treaty, which was then signed on. And now the African Medicines Agency will presumably become a reality this year, 2023. And tell us a bit more about what can we expect in the coming months in relation to the AMA?
No, I mean, the Africa Union has been, both the Africa Union Development Agency and the Commission have been very intentional in the work that they have done. And we're very impressed by the progress that they are making. It's not easy. It's a huge continent. We as partners who support them would like to see things moving much more quickly, but they've done a terrific job on the technical side, led by Auda Nepad. They have put together the requirements in terms of AMA. What will be its procedures? The SOPs for inspections, for assessment. What's the scope of the AMA product? And this is out for public comment now. So industry and all stakeholders can say, no, we think this should be this way. So they've put that out. So there's very good progress on that side, thinking about the technical elements of AMA and how it will operate. And of course, at the end of the day, the AMA governing board will need to pronounce itself on these, but at least in terms of getting these ready so that the board doesn't have to commission this from the beginning, there's very good progress on that front. So
is the governing board in place already? Has it been named?
I'm coming to that. So the governing board is expected that should be in place, we understand, by the end of August,
this year.
August of this year. So the ministers of health will meet in August, we understand, and they will inaugurate the first board of AMA. And then that board will move forward now to, drive the process forward to appoint a director general. We understand the ministers have ratified the terms of reference for the director general. So the board will have the responsibility to do that, do the selection, and come back to the conference of the parties, the ministers of health, and say, these are our top candidates, and agree and move forward. And they think that could happen by the end of the year, to have a DG. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. I think if it happened even by the end of Q1, for me, I would be very happy.
Of 2024.
24, just given, the runway that you need to find good candidates, interview them, and so forth. But, they're saying by the end of the year, potentially. I think end of the year, Q1, for me, is still very good. And then the DG and the board then would work together to begin now to roll out and build an organization, recruit the rest of the staff for the secretariat, engage with the countries in Rwanda, which is the host country, to begin, as the space is already provided by the government of Rwanda, fantastic space, to begin to put that together, to begin to put together the technical processes, the business processes, and lay out a roadmap. I think announce that to stakeholders and say, this is what we're doing. We think by this date we'll be ready to put out our first expression of interest. Hopefully before the end of 2024, that would be great, for AMA to be ready to receive the first application for the scope of products that they have, and for them to lay out a long-term vision so they can have, member states and partners rally around them. As 23 countries have ratified already. They also still need to do more to get more countries to ratify the AMA. Nigeria, Tanzania, South Africa,
Have they ratified or have they not?
They have not ratified. AMA needs these countries, so Ethiopia, Kenya, and so on and so forth, need to be part of AMA. So they still have there's still a lot of work, no doubt about it. But I think the progress is quite positive, at this point. So I think those are the key announcements that you'll be hearing. I think the DIA community going onto the AUDA NEPAD website and commenting on those procedures will be very helpful. The industry community, and then once the board is in place to collaborate with them. I'm sure when they develop their funding framework, it will include fees, and they will come back to the industry community and say,
a user fee mechanism such as we've seen in other parts of the world.
Exactly. This is what we're proposing and putting forward. And in our conversations with them, we've been encouraging them to try and find a way to engage industry more regularly, going forward. Now that, the building blocks are beginning to come into place. But, I mean, that's a call that the African Union has to make on the right timing to do that.
You mentioned applications to the agency. I take it that means marketing approval applications to the agency as opposed to clinical trial applications, or both?
I think initially it will be eventually both. I mean, all regulatory functions are in scope for AMA. But I think practically, and what we understand, I think initially will be marketing authorization applications and not binding opinions. Let's put context on that. The AMA treaty says AMA will issue opinions that are not binding, but then they will be applicable at the country level. So that inspections together as a continent, and then I think down the road, maybe year 2, year 3, they will include clinical trials. AVREF is already doing that, the Africa Vaccine Regulatory Forum. That will fold into AMA and become the clinical trial function of AMA. So the work that AVREF has done to do joint reviews of clinical trial applications with regulators and ethics, that will fold into AMA. And then pharmacovigilance is very important. That too, for the products that will come through AMA, that should come along the way. It's a lot of work. But medicinal products first, I think. But the scope is huge. They have devices in there. They have herbal medicines. They have veterinary medicines. So the board will have to think through these things, I think, with the DG and say, what can we manage and phase it out? My counsel would be, phase this out and make sure that you set up processes for medicinal products well, and then think about the subsequent elements. And then emergencies. I think AMA will play an important role for the continent in terms of products during emergencies and, emergency, tools like emergency use authorization, emergency use listing, and so forth. So
have the relative jurisdictions of the AMA and the individual states, countries, been worked out, or do they remain to be worked out? Does the treaty cover the relative jurisdictions sufficiently, or does more work need to be done to define who is responsible for what?
It's a great question, and I think the procedures that have been put out for public comment include the scope of AMA products. When you look at that, you will see, for example, very clearly from the beginning, they're saying, look, the products that are eligible for WHO pre-qualification will not be in scope for AMA, so to make that clear distinction so there's no confusion. And then secondly, AMA will not do generics, those will be done at the national and perhaps regional level. AMA will do new active substances, vaccines, biologicals, small molecules, new chemical entities, and they've defined the category of diseases, non-communicable diseases, oncology, etc., and things like monoclonals, advanced therapies, gene therapy, etc. Those kind of products.
Okay.
Also, I think one of the things that's being discussed on the continent is the maturity level of AMA, and I think WHO is going to play an important role here to help develop a very clear roadmap around helping AMA to become maturity level 3 very quickly, become WHO-listed authority perhaps by year 5 or even sooner. So it has that gravitas and the imprimatur, to be respected as an agency by the member states, by the global community. So I think that has to be in the roadmap of AMA. very quickly getting there. And I think once AMA gets to becoming a WHO listed authority along the way, the sky's the limit. The sky will be the limit.
That's a wonderful note to end our conversation with, David. Thank you so much for your time today, for your insights, for your hard work on behalf of Africa and on behalf of our magazine. Much appreciated.
No, thank you very much. And I think the special thanks goes to our African partners, the African Union, who do all this work. We play a supportive role. And the other partners, there are quite many, the European Medicines Agency and a couple of others. So thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, Alberto.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. For DIA Global Forum, I'm Alberto Grignolo.